Welcome to Strange Reads. I'm David, and today's story is The Upper Berth by F. Marion Crawford. These wealthy Victorian era types, such as Frances Marion Crawford, certainly loved to explore the world. You can see where the travelling aspect of the Gothic novel came from. Before he'd finished his studies, Crawford had attended Cambridge, Heidelberg, Rome and Harvard universities. I was just happy to graduate from Curtin in WA.
Born on the 2nd of August 1854 in Bagnaluca, Tuscany, to parents Thomas Crawford, an American sculptor, and his wife Louisa Cutler Ward, Francis had one sister and later a half-sister. He studied at St. Paul's School in the US before being accepted to Cambridge University. Afterwards, he went to the University of Heidelberg and the University of Rome. At age 25, he travelled to India, where he studied Sanskrit and edited the Indian Herald for 2 years. His studies in Sanskrit continued when he finally returned to the United States and attended Harvard University. Settling in Boston with his Aunt Julia and Uncle Sam Ward, he tried unsuccessfully to become an operatic baritone. Worried about his prospects, Crawford's Uncle Sam suggested he try writing about his experiences in India and helped him to develop contacts with New York publishers. By 1882, Crawford produced his first novel, Mr. Isaacs, with immediate success. This allowed him to move back to Italy permanently. He settled in Sant Agnello and bought the Villa Renzi, changing its name to the Villa Crawford. More than half of his novels are set in Italy. He also produced historical studies of the country among his non-fiction works. In 1897, he published Corleone, the fourth book in his Sarricanesca series, considered the first significant treatment of the mafia in literature. In October 1884, he married Elizabeth Burden, the daughter of the American Civil War Union General Hiram Burden. During Crawford's 1897 to 1898 lecture tour, an accident occurred at a glass smelting works that severely injured his lungs. The novelist had been collecting research for his historical novel, Marietta. Still suffering complications from his lung injury, Crawford died from a heart attack in Sorrento, southern Italy, on Good Friday, 1909. Crawford's daughters, Lady Eleanor Rocker Crawford and Mother Claire Marion Crawford, donated Villa Crawford to the Salesian Sisters, who now operate it as a high school for girls.
The Upper Berth is one of those stories I've chosen because you don't really hear about it these days. You might find it in the occasional ghost story anthology. At the beginning of the story, Crawford spends a bit of time boring us when the characters are being bored, and he spends a lot of time describing the characters. I'm not sure that would happen within a story published today. However, once the spooky goodness starts, it really starts. For a full reading of The Upper Berth, please check out our Strange Readings playlist.
Somebody asked for cigars. A group of men are gathered talking, drinking wine, but the conversation has assumed such proportions of tedium it would bore Prometheus from his rock. Somebody called for cigars, and the men looked toward the man named Brisbane. He's a strong, good-looking man, and after gaining everyone's attention, he says, "People are always asking whether anybody has ever seen a ghost. I have." The dreary evening had been saved. Brisbane was going to tell a story. He describes himself as an old sailor, a man familiar with many crossings of the Atlantic. Such awareness gifted the man knowledge of certain ships. He had his favourites and expressed a habit of waiting for them when needing to cross that duck pond. On the occasion he spoke of, Brisbane boarded the Kamchatka, a former favourite. He says former because now she is most definitely not. Upon informing his steward of his room, 105, lower berth, the man appeared awkward. Brisbane interpreted the steward's disposition as being that of a man needing a drink. However, in hindsight, he had done the man an injustice. The ship set sail without incident, the weather warm and sultry. Brisbane remarks at the usual events of a sea journey. At first, the tables are crowded, but slowly become thinned as pale-faced travellers fall foul of seasickness. One passage across the Atlantic is very much like another, he says. On the first night, Brisbane decides to turn in early. As he returned to his berth, he noticed another man in the upper berth. A portmanteau, similar to his own, rested in the opposite corner. Brisbane had hoped to be alone, and the appearance of his companion came as a disappointment. In the course of judging the man, and jumping to many conclusions about his type, Brisbane decides to avoid him at all costs. If you get to know that sort of person, they're always turning up, he says. However, all these decisions made about the man are futile, for he never saw the man again. In the night, Brisbane is awoken after the man sprang from the upper berth to the floor. In the darkness, he heard his companion fumbling with the latch and the bolt before fleeing down the passage at full speed. Brisbane, annoyed by the disturbance, got up and shut the door before returning to bed and to sleep. Sometime in the night, he woke, feeling a disagreeable cold. The air was damp, and above him, his roommate turned in the upper berth. Brisbane pulled up the sheets and drifted back to sleep, framing the fiery complaints he would make the next day. At daybreak, he woke to a vicious cold, unaccountably so for June. He turned his head, saw the porthole hooked open, and audibly swore. Without pause, he latched it closed, and before leaving, he noticed his companion had closed the curtains on the upper berth. Keen to avoid his roommate, Brisbane went on deck and started a conversation with the ship's doctor. When he recounts the night's events, Brisbane also tells the doctor his room number and is surprised when the man is visibly startled. The doctor states, "Everybody who slept in that room for the last 3 trips has gone overboard," and then suggests Brisbane leaves room 105 and comes to share his room. But Brisbane declines, stating that he will be the exception to this rule. Later in the day, the captain calls for Brisbane and explains that his roommate has indeed gone overboard. Brisbane's tale of the previous night matches perfectly with the one told by his predecessors. The captain offers him a change of room, but again, Brisbane declines. That night, Brisbane is preparing for bed. He bolts the door, throws open the curtains of the upper berth, and then realizes the porthole is open. Infuriated, he chases down the steward and berates him. Only the steward declares the porthole impossible to keep closed and wagers it will reopen inside half an hour. Brisbane dozes off, thinking of his ex-roommate tossing about in the sea miles behind the ship, when suddenly he's roused by a draft of cold air. The porthole stood wide open and fastened back. He closes the plate and turns the screws tight, when behind him he senses movement from one of the berths, and then a groan. Brisbane leapt across the room and thrust his hands into the upper berth to discover someone there. A gust of stagnant seawater burst from behind the curtain, and then the creature followed. It knocked Brisbane back before charging from the room. Briefly, Brisbane gave chase, but the thing disappeared into the night. Upon returning to the room, he found the porthole latched open and a stench of seawater pervading the whole place. Once again, he closed the porthole, this time wrenching it tight with his heavy stick. He sat there all night watching the blasted thing. In the morning, he met the doctor on deck and again told him of his uncomfortable night. The man is not keen to share watch of the room with Brisbane, but later, after talking with the captain, he finds an accomplice. They ordered the ship's carpenter to examine and test the room, but found it to be in perfect order. The workmen cautioned the men to give it up before departing the scene. Brisbane is impressed by the captain's resolute demeanour. They decide not to quit until they have an answer. That night, the men returned to the stateroom. The porthole remained screwed down. Brisbane opened the curtains to the upper berth, and they placed the portmanteau in front of the door so nothing could get out of the room. The captain starts to share the story of the lunatic who first jumped off the ship. When Brisbane's attention is drawn to the brass loop nut of the porthole, it seems to be unscrewing itself. The captain proclaimed that the second man lost from the stateroom went out through that porthole. On the night, the sea flooded in through the open port. Ever since, the room smells of seawater. Suddenly, the reading lantern extinguished, and the curtain of the upper berth swung out into the room. In the same moment, the captain cried out. He wrestled with the brass loop of the port as it unscrewed within his hands. The men failed to stop the porthole from opening. The captain stood back, his lips pale. "There's something in that berth," he yelled. Brisbane attacked the upper berth, seizing something within. Something ghostly, long drowned and yet moving with the strength of 10 men. Dead white eyes stared back out at him, and the air stank of putrid seawater. Brisbane finally succumbed, falling backward under the assault. The captain struck it a violent blow, but then he too fell forward, overpowered by the thing. For a moment, this terrible figure stood above them before exiting through the port. The men lay hurt and stunned on the floor. Brisbane knew his arm to be broken. "Well, do you want to hear any more?" Brisbane declared. "There is nothing more." Brisbane stated he finished the trip in the surgeon's room. The carpenter screwed the cabin closed, and neither Brisbane or the captain travelled aboard that ship again. And that is how I saw a ghost. If it was a ghost, it was dead, anyhow.
In 1929, M.R. James, a connoisseur of the ghost story, remarked that the upper berth stands high amongst ghost stories. And I think it still does. Whether it's a ghost or a sea-soaked ghoul, there's a kind of dread that sticks around long after you've finished the story. Not bad for a tale published in 1894.
The first thing that strikes the reader about the upper berth is that it's a proper old-fashioned ghost story. Brisbane's account is presented like a story over a campfire. In 1894, without TV, phones or other modern distractions, people entertained each other. Without the fanciful tale, evenings dared to be dull. Parallels occur between Brisbane and many of Lovecraft's protagonists. A proclaimed fan of the story, stating that it is one of the most tremendous horror stories in all literature. Lovecraft often sent intrepid investigators into the maw of eldritch horrors with more of a thirst for knowledge than the limbic drive for self-preservation. Much like Brisbane, Crawford travelled the world and gained familiarity with different locations and modes of travel. Brisbane has seen it all before. From this perspective, he is better armed to investigate the strange. Passengers using room 105 before him, perhaps new to crossing the Atlantic, fell victim to its haunted past. M.R. James, the famous ghost story author, referenced Marion Crawford in his essay Some Remarks on Ghost Stories, published in The Bookman, December 1929. He said, "The Upper Berth is the best in Crawford's collection of uncanny tales and stands high among ghost stories in general. I believe the story remains with the reader as it has several literary hooks which burrow their way into your psychology. 1. The Upper Berth itself is a bed directly above our protagonist. Sleeping so close to something so dreadful appeals to our fear of being close to a threat before identifying it. 2. The story appeals to our senses, describing the smells of the room and the sensation of grabbing the thing's limbs. 3. The story is chilling and distressing, yet simple. The reader can easily imagine themselves in Brisbane's shoes. 4. And whilst terrifying, the ghost is not really a direct threat. If a passenger dies from exposure to the thing, it's because they've been psychologically tormented to throw themselves overboard. This asks the reader to contemplate, what did the thing do or say to make the passengers commit suicide? And is there something in my life that could make me act so out of character? Anthologized numerous times, The Upper Berth may already sit on your shelf somewhere. You may expect it to be dusty and lying under cobwebs, but it is more likely slippery and putrid with the stench of dank seawater.
Much like The Upper Berth, there are a lot of hidden gems out there, and if you have one, please let us all know in the comments. Please hit the like button, it helps other people find our channel, and subscribe because this ship has finished its voyage. Discover more speculative fiction tales in one of our other episodes. Don't be a stranger, subscribe and become a stranger. And remember, keep it strange. Is that porthole open? It came.